If you open a map of the Indo-Pacific theater and look closely at the geopolitical chessboard, it is very easy to fall into a state of strategic despair. It looks as though the People's Republic of China holds every single card. The Chinese Communist Party has spent the last 25 years executing a masterpiece of anti-access/area denial, universally known as A2/AD. They have dredged millions of tons of sand from the ocean floor to construct a chain of heavily fortified, unsinkable artificial islands throughout the South China Sea. They have blanketed their eastern coastline with the most diverse, lethal and densely concentrated arsenal of conventional ballistic and cruise missiles in human history. If you are an Allied naval commander looking at the prospect of fighting a high-intensity kinetic war within the first island chain, defending Taiwan or the Philippines from a massive amphibious invasion, you are staring at a mathematical meat grinder. To engage the Chinese military in their own backyard is to sail a surface fleet directly into a highly sophisticated, overlapping kill web of hypersonic glide vehicles, land-based bomber squadrons, and synchronized drone swarms. The conventional wisdom dictates that fighting the Chinese Navy in the Pacific Ocean is a suicide mission. And the Australian Defence Force agrees. Which is why they have decided they are not going to fight the decisive battle there. Instead, they are going to execute the most devastating, high-stakes geographic flanking maneuver of the 21st century. To find the actual front line of the next World War, you have to drag the map away from the crowded, contested waters of the Pacific. You have to pan violently westward. You must cross the massive red dirt expanse of the Australian continent, push out past the coastal city of Perth, and venture deep into the isolated, vast and seemingly empty blue expanse of the Indian Ocean. Roughly 2,700 kilometers northwest of the Australian mainland lies a tiny, isolated coral atoll. A speck of sand and palm trees that is almost invisible on a standard globe. This is the Cocos, Keeling Islands. It is sovereign Australian territory. While the global media fixates on the posturing in the Taiwan Strait, the Australian government is quietly, methodically pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into the dirt of this tiny island. Heavy machinery is laying thick, military-grade asphalt. Massive logistical barges are offloading specialized aviation fuel storage tanks and reinforced concrete. Australia is not building a tourist resort. They are building a $568 million fortress. They are constructing an unsinkable aircraft carrier designed specifically to host the deadliest, most advanced sub-hunting and maritime strike aircraft on the planet. And they are pointing this geographic dagger directly at the single fatal vulnerability of the entire Chinese Empire. They are aiming it squarely at the Strait of Malacca. Today we are looking at the ultimate economic kill switch. Welcome to Doctrine of War. Today we are pulling back the curtain on the grand strategy of the Indo-Pacific and exposing the geographic masterstroke that guarantees the survival of the free world. Here is the thesis for this episode. You do not need to defeat an adversary's military if you can simply turn off their engines. In modern, industrialized warfare, the nation that controls the supply chain controls the outcome of the war. A superpower with 10,000 tanks and 1,000 fighter jets is completely paralyzed if it cannot secure the crude oil required to refine the diesel and aviation fuel that makes those machines run. If you are beginning to understand why the true balance of geopolitical power is not decided by who fires the first missile, but by the relentless, unsentimental mathematics of global shipping lanes, maritime choke points, and sovereign geography, hit that like button and subscribe to Doctrine of War. We strip away the loud, explosive illusions of combat to bring you the cold, kinetic realities of grand strategy, logistics, and macroeconomic warfare. Your support is what keeps this channel operating at the absolute tip of the spear. For years, the narrative surrounding Australian defense was purely reactionary. The assumption was that Australia would simply act as a passive, southern sanctuary while the United States fought the war up north. The militarization of the Cocos Islands proves that assumption is dead. We are going to break down the Malacca dilemma, the terrifying energy hostage crisis that keeps Chinese leadership awake at night. We are going to explore the unsinkable carrier, the staggering $568 million engineering reality of turning a remote coral atoll into a forward operating base for 85-ton apex predators. We will analyze the doctrine of horizontal escalation, how the West plans to refuse the meat grinder of the South China Sea and outflank Beijing in the Indian Ocean. And finally, we will dismantle the overland illusion, proving exactly why China cannot simply use Russian pipelines to escape this geographic trap. Let us begin by looking at the most critical, congested, and vulnerable strip of water on the face of the Earth, the 1.5-mile jugular vein. To truly appreciate the absolute, sheer terror that the Cocos Islands upgrade strikes into the hearts of the strategic planners in Beijing, you must first understand the fundamental, incurable genetic defect of the Chinese economic miracle. The People's Republic of China is an industrial titan. It is the manufacturing floor of the world. It boasts a rapidly expanding middle class, sprawling megacities, and a military machine that is modernizing at a blistering pace. But this entire, colossal edifice rests on a foundation that China itself does not control. China is devastatingly, hopelessly addicted to foreign energy. Despite massive domestic investments in coal and renewable energy, the critical sectors of the Chinese economy, heavy logistics, maritime shipping, aviation, and most importantly, the mechanized divisions of the People's Liberation Army, PLA, run exclusively on refined liquid fossil fuels. You cannot power a Type 055 guided missile cruiser with a solar panel, and you cannot fly a J-20 stealth fighter on a lithium-ion battery. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil, and the vast, overwhelming majority of that oil originates in the Middle East and Africa. To get from the loading terminals of Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Angola to the refineries on the eastern seaboard of China, that oil must travel by sea. It is loaded onto very large crude carriers, VLCCs, massive, sluggish, unarmored behemoths that measure a quarter-mile in length and carry up to 2 million barrels of crude oil in their bellies. These leviathans must cross the vast, deep expanse of the Indian Ocean. But to exit the Indian Ocean and enter the South China Sea, they cannot sail in a straight line. They must funnel into one of the most treacherous, congested, and geographically constrained waterways on the planet. They must pass through the Strait of Malacca. Bordered by the landmasses of Malaysia, Singapore, and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, the Strait of Malacca is a 500-mile-long geographic funnel. Every single day, a continuous, unbroken chain of supertankers carries roughly 80% of China's entire imported oil supply through this narrow corridor. As the ships travel south towards Singapore, the strait narrows dramatically. At the Phillips Channel, the navigable deep-water shipping lane shrinks to a width of merely 1.5 nautical miles. This is the Malacca Dilemma. It is a term famously coined in 2003 by then-Chinese President Hu Jintao, acknowledging the CCP's greatest strategic nightmare. The Chinese Empire possesses a singular, exposed jugular vein. It is a 1.5-mile-wide strip of water thousands of miles away from the Chinese mainland. If an adversarial power were to drop a steel curtain across that channel, the flow of oil would instantly cease. The calculus of deprivation. Let us wargame the exact mathematical timeline of what happens when that jugular is severed. If the Western Alliance successfully executes a blockade of the Strait of Malacca, the Sunda Strait, and the Lombok Strait, the physical delivery of seaborne crude oil to China drops by over 80% overnight. This is an event that immediately transcends military strategy and becomes an apocalyptic macroeconomic crisis. Like all major powers, China maintains a Strategic Petroleum Reserve, SPR. The exact capacity of this reserve is a highly classified state secret, heavily guarded by the CCP. However, Western intelligence estimates and independent energy analysts generally agree that China holds anywhere from 90 to perhaps 120 days of net imports in its strategic reserves and commercial storage facilities combined. The moment the blockade is established in the Indian Ocean, a hard, unforgiving 120-day countdown timer begins on the survival of the Chinese state. Within the first 30 days, the central government in Beijing would be forced to implement immediate, draconian, wartime rationing. The civilian economy would be sacrificed to preserve the military. Civilian air travel would be grounded entirely. Private vehicle usage would be heavily restricted or banned. The vast fleet of diesel-powered trucks required to transport food from the agricultural interior to the coastal megacities would be throttled, triggering immediate supply chain failures, food shortages, and the potential for massive internal civil unrest. The manufacturing sector, starved of power and raw materials, would grind to a halt. The export economy would collapse. By day 60, the strategic impact would hit the front lines of the Pacific War. The PLA Navy, attempting to sustain high-intensity, fuel-hungry combat operations in the Philippine Sea, would be ordered to drastically curtail its operational tempo. Destroyers and frigates would be forced to remain in port to conserve marine diesel. The PLA Air Force would have to limit combat air patrols to preserve specialized aviation turbine fuel. By day 90 to 120, the Chinese military machine would face complete, total paralysis. You do not need to sink the Chinese Navy. If you cut the oil in the Indian Ocean, the Chinese Navy becomes a collection of incredibly expensive stationary steel targets. The Malacca dilemma is the ultimate kill switch for the Chinese economy, and Australia is currently building the finger designed to press that switch, forging the Coral Citadel. If the strategy is to execute a distant maritime blockade and sever the Malacca Strait, you face an immediate logistical problem. The Indian Ocean is vast. You cannot effectively blockade the Indonesian archipelago by launching surveillance aircraft from the Australian mainland. The distances are simply too great. An aircraft taking off from RAF Base Pierce near Perth would have to fly over 2,500 kilometers just to reach the operational area. By the time it arrived on station, it would have burned half its fuel, leaving only a fraction of an hour to loiter, hunt enemy submarines, or monitor shipping before it had to turn around and fly back. To execute a blockade, you need a forward operating base. You need an unsinkable aircraft carrier permanently anchored directly adjacent to the choke points. This is the profound asymmetric geographic advantage of the Cocos, Keeling Islands. Located 2,700 kilometers northwest of Perth, and merely 1,000 kilometers southwest of the Indonesian coast, the Cocos Islands sit squarely astride the primary maritime approaches to the Sunda and Malacca Straits. It is the perfect strategic outpost. But a tropical paradise with a small, civilian airstrip is useless in a high-intensity war. To transform this coral atoll into a military fortress, the Australian Department of Defence authorised a massive, complex engineering megaproject. Under a contract valued at over $568 million Australian dollars, the ADF is executing a complete overhaul of the airfield on West Island. This is a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. Because the island is so remote, every single piece of heavy machinery, every ton of specialized asphalt, every length of reinforced steel rebar, and every worker must be shipped in via specialized barges and transport vessels from the Australian mainland. They are widening the runway. They are radically strengthening the subbase and the tarmac to military load-bearing specifications. They are building massive new reinforced parking aprons. They are constructing specialized, hardened aviation fuel storage facilities and new maritime offload points to ensure the island can be resupplied during a conflict. Why is the ADF pouring $500 million into strengthening the asphalt on a tiny island? Because the aircraft they intend to land there is a monster, the airborne assassin. The entire purpose of the Cocos Islands upgrade is to allow the Royal Australian Air Force, RAF, to permanently base and rotate the Boeing P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft from the territory. To call the P-8A Poseidon a surveillance plane is a catastrophic understatement. It is an 85-ton heavily armed flying server room. It is the undisputed apex predator of the ocean surface and the subsurface domain. Built on the rugged, reliable airframe of a Boeing 737-800, the P-8A is engineered specifically to find, track, and kill enemy naval assets. When a P-8A takes off from the newly fortified runway on the Cocos Islands, it is instantly on station. It does not have to waste fuel transiting from the mainland. It can immediately begin executing its lethal mission profile across the eastern Indian Ocean and the approaches to the Straits. The sensory capabilities of the P-8 are terrifying. It is equipped with the AN/APY-10 multi-mode radar, which possesses a resolution so incredibly high that it can not only detect a submarine's periscope reaching the waves from miles away, but it can utilize synthetic aperture radar, SAR, to generate photographic quality images of surface ships through thick cloud cover or at night. To hunt the Chinese nuclear attack submarines that will inevitably attempt to break through the blockade to escort the oil tankers, the P-8 utilizes a massive payload of sonobuoys. The aircraft drops these highly sensitive acoustic sensors into the water in complex, overlapping geometric patterns. The sonobuoys act as a temporary deployable underwater mesh network, listening for the faint, mechanical hum of an adversary submarine's propulsion system. The P-8's onboard supercomputers process this acoustic data in real time, instantly triangulating the exact location of the enemy sub hidden in the dark water below. Once the target is acquired, the P-8 does not need to call for backup. It opens its internal weapons bay and drops a Mk-54 lightweight anti-submarine torpedo. The torpedo enters the water, activates its own active sonar seeker, and autonomously hunts down and destroys the submarine. But the P-8 is not just a sub-hunter. It is a ship killer. Packed under its wings are AGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship cruise missiles, and it is currently being integrated with the highly advanced, stealthy long-range anti-ship missile, RASM. From the unsinkable carrier of the Cocos Islands, a squadron of RAF P-8 Poseidons can project an inescapable, heavily armed dome of radar coverage and strike capability directly across the global energy supply chain. Any vessel attempting to run the blockade can be detected, identified, and sent to the bottom of the Indian Ocean in a matter of minutes. Refusing the meat grinder. The militarization of the Cocos Islands represents a fundamental, highly sophisticated evolution in Western grand strategy. It is the operationalization of a concept known as horizontal escalation. To understand horizontal escalation, you must understand the alternative, which is what Beijing desperately wants the West to do. If a crisis erupts over Taiwan or the South China Sea, the Chinese military strategy relies entirely on drawing the United States and its allies into a symmetrical or vertical escalation in the immediate region. Beijing has spent 3 decades preparing for a fight in the first island chain. They want the US Navy to sail its aircraft carrier strike groups directly into the Philippine Sea. They want the US Air Force to try and launch fighters from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. What? Because that is the exact geographic envelope where the Chinese anti-access/area denial A2/AD network is strongest. It is the home field advantage. The PLA rocket force has thousands of DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles specifically pre-targeted at the approaches to Taiwan. The airspace is saturated by Chinese S-400 surface-to-air missile batteries and overlapping fighter patrols. If the West agrees to fight a localized, contained war inside the South China Sea, they are walking straight into a meticulously prepared, multi-trillion-dollar meat grinder. The losses in Western ships and aircraft would be catastrophic, and the outcome of the war would be decided entirely on Beijing's terms. Horizontal escalation dictates that you never, ever fight the enemy where they are strongest. If the enemy attacks you in a specific geographic theater where they hold the advantage, you do not meet them head-on. You escalate the conflict horizontally, striking them in a completely different geographic theater or economic domain where you hold the overwhelming, undeniable advantage. The Indian Ocean Trap. By building the fortress at the Cocos Islands, Australia is officially opening the second front. If China launches an invasion force across the Taiwan Strait, Australia and the United States will not limit their response to the Western Pacific. The Australian Defence Force will immediately seal the Indian Ocean. This creates a terrifying, mathematically unsolvable two-front nightmare for the Chinese Communist Party. They are suddenly forced to fight a high-intensity kinetic war against the US Pacific Fleet in the east, while simultaneously watching their entire national economy and energy supply chain being methodically suffocated in the west. The genius of this strategy is that China possesses virtually zero ability to project sustained military power into the Indian Ocean to break the blockade. While the Chinese Navy has a massive fleet, it is a fleet optimized for the first island chain. If they want to send a naval task force to the Indian Ocean to protect their oil tankers and destroy the Australian P-8s based on the Cocos Islands, that Chinese fleet must sail out of the South China Sea and transit through the very straits that the Allies now control. They would have to run a gauntlet of Allied nuclear attack submarines, land-based anti-ship missiles, and massive air power just to reach the Indian Ocean. And even if they survived the transit, they would arrive in the Indian Ocean without any land-based air cover, fighting thousands of miles away from their home ports, at the absolute end of a highly vulnerable logistical tether. Furthermore, the Cocos Islands do not operate in isolation. They form the southern anchor of an inescapable net. To the north, the Indian military has heavily militarized the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which sit directly over the northern entrance to the Malacca Strait. To the west, the United States operates the massive, heavily fortified bomber base and naval logistical hub at Diego Garcia. When you draw lines connecting the Andaman Islands, Diego Garcia, and the Cocos Islands, you create the Indian Ocean Trap. It is a massive, overlapping triangle of Western and Allied military dominance that completely swallows the sea lanes. China is geopolitically boxed in. They built a fortress in the South China Sea, only to realize that the West holds the keys to the only door leading out. The pipeline fallacy. When Western strategic analysts bring up the devastating reality of the Malacca dilemma, apologists for the Chinese regime and certain geopolitical commentators inevitably present the same counter-argument. They point to the map and argue that China has already solved the blockade problem. They point to the massive, multi-billion-dollar overland pipelines constructed under the Belt and Road Initiative. They point to the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean (ESPO) pipeline bringing oil from Russia, the pipeline crossing through Kazakhstan, and the Sino-Myanmar pipeline connecting the Bay of Bengal directly to the Chinese province of Yunnan. They argue that if the West blockades the oceans, China will simply import all the oil it needs over land, completely bypassing the maritime choke points. This argument is a masterclass in geographical illiteracy and mathematical delusion. The reality of global energy transport is defined by the brutal, uncompromising physics of fluid dynamics and pipeline capacity. Pipelines are incredibly expensive, technologically complex to build, and they possess a fixed, absolute maximum capacity. You cannot magically double the flow of oil through a 48-inch steel pipe just because there is a war on. Let us look at the actual numbers. If you combine the maximum, optimal operating capacity of every single overland oil pipeline flowing into China, from Russia, from Central Asia, and from Myanmar, and assume zero maintenance issues or sabotage, they can deliver approximately 1.5 to perhaps 2 million barrels of oil per day. Every single day, the Chinese economy and military require the importation of roughly 10 to 11 million barrels of crude oil. The math is absolute. The overland pipelines can barely supply 20% of China's daily requirement. To put that in perspective, a single very large crude carrier, VLCC, sailing through the Strait of Malacca holds 2 million barrels of oil. A single ship carries the equivalent of the entire daily output of China's combined overland pipeline network. The pipelines are a peacetime luxury. They are a rounding error. In a wartime blockade scenario, they are mathematically incapable of sustaining the energy demands of a 1.4 billion person economy and a mobilized, continental military apparatus. The overland illusion is a myth. China is a maritime-dependent nation. There is no escape from the sea, the ultimate geographic weapon. The $568 million runway upgrade currently tearing up the coral and sand of the Cocos, Keeling, Islands is not just another infrastructure project. It is the physical manifestation of grand strategy. For decades, the West allowed itself to be intimidated by the sheer scale of the Chinese military buildup. We focused endlessly on the numbers, the count of destroyers, the production rate of stealth fighters, the range of hypersonic missiles. We allowed the adversary to dictate the terms of the engagement, assuming we would have to fight them in the meat grinder of their own making. The militarization of the Cocos Islands is the moment the West changed the rules of the game. Australia has realized that its isolation is not a weakness, it is the ultimate geographic weapon. By weaponizing the tiny outposts in the Indian Ocean, Australia has transformed the vast, empty expanse of the sea into an insurmountable barrier. We do not need to match the Chinese Navy ship for ship. We do not need to sacrifice thousands of sailors trying to penetrate the South China Sea. We simply have to step back, lock the gate in the Indian Ocean, and hold the global supply chain hostage. The Cocos Trap proves that the Anglosphere possesses the strategic vision, the heavy industrial capacity, and the geographic dominance required to win a protracted global conflict. The next time an adversary threatens to launch an invasion in the Pacific, they will be forced to look over their shoulder, thousands of kilometers to the west. They will have to calculate the terrifying reality that the moment they fire the first shot, the P-8 Poseidons will launch from the Cocos Islands, the steel curtain will drop across the Strait of Malacca, and the countdown to their own economic suffocation will begin. The Malacca dilemma remains unsolved, and the finger of the Australian Defence Force is resting firmly on the kill switch. Thanks for watching Doctrine of War. Do you believe that the threat of a distant blockade in the Indian Ocean is enough to permanently deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Or will Beijing find a way to break the chokehold? Let us know your tactical assessment in the comments below. Stay sharp, stay strategic, and we'll see you in the next one.